Hey, Jamie.
Hey, what's up, Tim?
In the TV episode of Madam Secretary that we watched, we learned that the entire nuclear command and control system is entirely dependent on people reading codes and attack plans out of binders. So many binders. It's like an episode of Parks and Recreation where Leslie Knope becomes president and Jerry confuses a flock of birds for a nuclear attack.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear security for a living. I'm not joined today by my usual co-host, Gabe, because he's out avoiding my calls after I pranked him one too many times that he should seek shelter because of an incoming nuclear missile attack. Some people seem like just can't take a joke. But fortunately, I am joined instead today by an awesome guest, Jamie Withorne, a recent graduate of Columbia University, a founding member of Women of Mass Destruction, an advisory board member of Girl Security, and a policy intern at Global Zero. Jamie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I know you were out in California having a good time. I appreciate you waking up so early and coming up on the podcast over Skype.
Yeah.
You actually, I think, approached me about the podcast because you really wanted to do an episode on what we're going to talk about today, which is Madam Secretary, the TV show starring, is it Tia Leone?
Correct. Yeah.
Yep, as the Secretary of State who is coming out of a career out of the CIA, and she's a hard-nosed, policy-oriented, tough political actor going up against some really difficult resistance, whether it's like people in the government or people in foreign countries that she's trying to have to grapple with. And it happens to be that the finale of season 4, episode called Night Watch, had a lot of nuclear content. So I'm really glad. I don't watch this show, but I'm really glad that you brought this to my attention. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're here to talk about silly topics like how nukes are portrayed in popular culture, but we're also here to talk a little bit about your work that you've done on bringing women into the international security realm, into nonproliferation in particular, because this is a field that's, for a long time it's been largely dominated by older white men. So I appreciate all the work that you've done here. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that before we get started on the how does this TV show portray nuclear weapons?
Right, absolutely. Great. So as you mentioned briefly before, I'm currently the founder and manager of a website I created called womenofmassdestruction.org. And with this website, really, I'm just trying to kind of create a sort of academic commons to bring all of the work women are doing in both international security and nuclear security, kind of more specifically, into one site. So it's easy access for that. Because a lot of times you hear the argument, oh, yeah, we want to include women, we just don't know where the work is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to make that not an excuse, right? So I created a website that focuses on both media kind of references to women in like news media, women in academia, so kind of writings and textbooks, and I provided some tools on how to make sure your syllabus, if you're a professor or a teacher, can be gender kind of inclusive. So there's
terrific.
A tool that calculates it. And then I also have a social media page that essentially has my Twitter feed where I'm always retweeting all sorts of different kind of resources for women. So that's at women_WMD. And with that one, I do, again, focus on like, here's more lists and feeds. Because as soon as you start looking, there's a ton of resources out there that are working on amplifying and highlighting women's work. And so I just thought that it'd be useful to have like a running list there. And so that's kind of what my website tries to do. And so far, it's been a great adventure. And I'm learning that there are so many websites out there. So there's really no more like of an excuse not to include women, I think, in the dialogue.
Yeah, that's that excuse is rapidly dwindling.
Yeah.
What has the response been like from, say, I'm really interested. I didn't know that aspect you had with the syllabus. How has the response been to that particular aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So people actually have been reaching out a lot via Twitter and suggesting works to focus on, which I think is super helpful because as one person, I can't possibly find all of the women are authored nuclear security or security related pieces. So it's very helpful when people do reach out to me. And on the website, I do encourage, hey, if you want to be focused or if your work wants to be focused, go ahead and do that. I've also kind of shared it with my professors back at Columbia. I've said, hey, based on this one international security course I took, there was one woman author. Maybe you can fix that for future courses. Here's some helpful tools. So I've been kind of taking that initiative more so in the kind of actual institutionalized aspect of it. And I think it's going out over really well.
That's terrific. I know that there's this effort to eliminate manels, which are all male panels on.
Right. Yeah.
In our field, there's lots of panel discussions, and I've been responsible for organizing a lot of them. And, there's certainly times in the past where maybe it wasn't consciously an excuse, oh, I can't find a female to be on the panel. But it's one of those things where people are making a very strong pledge to, either organizing a panel, make sure you have equal representation where you can. If you're on a panel and you realize there's no one else that's on that panel and everyone looks like you, you want to say, I refuse to be on this panel unless you find out somebody else that can be on here. And here are some resources such as the one Jamie is working on. I like that pledge. I hope to see more of those. People will call them out if you have a panel that doesn't have equal representation. Things like that are the exact great ways to amplify diversity, because this field needs it. And I'm happy to see that this is going well.
Yeah, absolutely. And my other initiative, I'm taking part of this project called Girl Security, where I'm an advisory board. And so essentially what this project aims to do is to integrate national security curriculum to high school girls.
Oh, okay.
And so Lauren out of Boston kind of started up this project, and essentially what it is focusing on an earlier age to really start the conversation and start thinking about critical issues such as national security at an earlier age, so they can kind of better develop themselves within national security as they go through college. Because I know, for example, I didn't know that I liked national security specifically until I was a sophomore in college. And so I think it's really important to start the dialogue early. I think it's a really unique approach to the curriculum as well, because she talks a lot about what makes you feel secure as a girl, or what makes you feel secure as a student. And they all say X, Y, and Z, just in general. And then she goes on to kind of relate that back to national security. So I think it's a fantastic program that's just kind of sort of taking off, and I'm super excited to be involved with that.
That's awesome. Well, one thing to think about as we kind of do our discussions here about Madam Secretary is, do you think that this is a good resource that people should put on either a syllabus or to show it in classrooms? Does this show do a good job of bringing that piece of this discussion that's often missing? Because I know we're here really to talk about the, what people get right, what people get wrong, or what are the interesting themes, but obviously every piece of pop culture is a lot of how they first learn about these kind of topics. People learn about nuclear weapons because of movies or TV show that they've seen. Often it's not because they read a book about, deterrence theory. They're not reading, Herman Kahn, deterrence theory. They're watching Dr. Strangelove. This is my artful transition into talking about episode 22 of season 4 of Madam Secretary Night Watch. It first aired on May 20th in 2018. It was written by the show's creator and producer, Barbara Hall and David Gray, but it was informed in part by several members of our esteemed nuclear nonproliferation community, people such as former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, former Minuteman ICBM launch officer Bruce Blair, and Seth Gray, who is the president and CEO of Lightbridge Corporation, a company that deals with nuclear fuel technology, and the brother of David Gray. And this is all leading up to the fact that Jamie and I, when we first met, we went to a screening of the show, which was done through the Nuclear Security Working Group, a kind of partnership in DC that holds roundtable discussions and tries to bring together a bipartisan consensus on these kind of topics. And we got to hear from Seth Gray, as well as people such as former Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, Tom Countryman. So we got to hear not only what people who wrote the show thought about it, but people who informed the episode, and kind of a smarter people version of the podcast that I do, which is to have people talk about what was right, what was wrong, and what were the kind of the messages that they hope people that watch the show get out of it. So did you enjoy that experience? We had some popcorn and watched a movie at a fancy place.
Yeah, it was super fancy, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun to get all the fancier people together to watch kind of a show that I think is more like what everybody watches. So it brought them down to my level, which is pretty cool.
Excellent. All right, so let's run through the plot of the TV episode. And again, as usual, spoiler warning: if you haven't seen Madam Secretary and you want to, there's not like a ton of spoilers in here. It's not like the world ends or anything. Maybe that is a spoiler for us already here. The TV show does not end with nuclear war. There will be a 5th season. It's actually going to be starting pretty soon, I think in like a week or two. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we're wanting to do the episode we are now. But yeah, so how about we go back and forth on the plot here. We'll take some breaks to talk about some of the nuclear content. But why don't you start us off? Because you've said you've seen a few more episodes of Madam Secretary than I. I have not. I have not watched it more than the episode that we watched for the podcast. But seems like a pretty good, entertaining show. People seem like they really enjoy it. You want to start us off here about the episode Night Watch?
So the episode begins off with Teo Leone acting as Secretary of State Elizabeth McCord and her family. So her husband's kind of the CIA guy, and she has 3 children who are just kind of, I guess, stereotypical high school children concerned about their cell phones and all that jazz. And so they're trying to do a walking tour over at the Lincoln Memorial and trying to kind of disconnect their kids. Kids aren't having it, as you can expect with some high school kids. And so while they're kind of doing that, the camera pans to other staff, so including the president, who are like out walking their dogs or playing golf, and it just kind of seems like a nice, normal Washington morning.
Yeah, it seemed like their day off, like on the weekend.
Yeah, exactly. It was at when the National Security Advisor's phone rings with like an eerie, very scary kind of ringtone thing, indicating that a Stratcom is calling.
Stratcom. This is NSA Ellen Hill.
Which is never a nice weekend thing, I guess.
Yeah, they're never just calling to say hi.
Yeah, exactly. And so early warning satellite has detected multiple Russian launches, kind of is what the Stratcom goes into. And that's where the show picks up, I guess.
What the hell is it?
Early warning satellites detected multiple Russian launches.
What? Seligov can't be that crazy.
He said he'd hit us back after Syria.
By launching nukes?
Cover Falcon! Cover Falcon!
CIA Psych Eval of Salnikov indicated volatility and mood swings. We just killed 300 Russians in Aleppo.
Mr. President, I have Stratcom.
Put him on speaker, Captain.
Yes, sir. Colonel McPherson is on the line.
Colonel McPherson, what's the state rep?
Mr. President, SFARS is now tracking more than 400 Russian ICBMs, heading for U.S. mainland and striking in about 20 minutes.
Yeah, they say 400 incoming missiles from Russia to strike mainland USA. That's kind of scary, and it's going to hit in 20 minutes. They talk about monitoring stations in Alaska and London have confirmed incoming missiles.
And so the president, again, gets linked to Stratcom over a satellite phone, and he's making sure that there's not a hack in the system or it's not like a flaw. So he essentially calls and make sure that it's okay, but the military assures the president that there is an air gap in the system.
Yeah, that the actual system itself that controls command and control and communicates messages, that's separate from the broader internet. Like if you're not on the system, you can't get to it. I think it's we talked about this. We did an episode on war games, as any nuclear weapons movie podcast would do, and we go into detail about that. But it's this. I think was he the Secretary of Defense? I couldn't tell. Gordon, that guy. He seemed like he was speaking for the military. Maybe he was a Joint Chiefs guy.
I think so. Yeah.
I couldn't tell, but military voice says it can't possibly be anything but the real thing. You know, no mistake possible. This is not a hack. It's not a mistake. Bombs are incoming. Let's do something about it.
Right. Yep. So he's pretty secure in that.
Yep.
And so the National Security Advice, NSA recommends starting the Night Watch.
Sir, I recommend initiating Night Watch continuity of government protocol immediately.
Do it. Major, open the football.
And one of the staff members playing tennis gets a text to that effect, makes a quick exit. No one can reach Secretary McCord because she is kind of playing like a skee ball with her family.
I couldn't tell. It's supposed to be in D.C. I couldn't tell where that is because there's not really a... I mean, I don't know of any place in D.C. that's just like an open carnival all the time.
Maybe she was at like Rocket Bar or Penn Commons in Chinatown.
There we go. There we go. That's perfect. So they're playing. They're having a good time, and yeah, she's disconnected from the world, but I guess could be a good or a bad thing given what's happening.
Right. Yeah. So she got her goal of disconnecting, but then, nukes are coming. So after not being able to reach Secretary McCord, the president says to open the football, and it goes like right on the golf course and everything. So. Yep.
I guess it's kind of I don't know if they intended this, but there's the parallel world of the Secretary of State playing skee ball while the president opens up the nuclear football. So there are different games here. I like how the president, they open the football, and the football, which is the emergency satchel, the box, essentially it's like a briefcase. It's like a mobile communication system that allows the president to authenticate who he is or who she is, and talk to the military to be able to activate a launch. So that looks pretty accurate. I mean, they don't really see the inside of the box, but the outside of the suitcase, they got props for that. Everything looks good. I don't know if the football is in any other episode of the show. Like, do you always see a guy, usually a military or person behind the president holding the football? Do you see that person in other episodes too, or?
No. I think this is the first time he's kind of actually actively played a role or like been seen on camera.
Okay.
From my recollection, anyway.
The president and his team are out like on the golf course, and it's kind of comically deciding what nuclear attack plan they should be doing. It looks a lot like Tiger Woods and his caddy deciding on whether or not to use a 7-iron or an 8-wood. I think those are golf terms that are correct. But they're like debating about whether or not to go big or go small. Some people are recommending major attack option 1, which is the most devastating option to stop Russia from hitting us again, and that's what the National Security Advisor and the military guy Gordon is recommending.
And so there's the major attack option 1, or MAO, and then there are also limited attack options, which is LAO, and it's unclear, I guess, if there's an LAMO attack.
Yep.
Yes, and these are kind of all based on their operations plans.
Yeah, I guess there's like more detailed targets they could do. We're going to hit China with this and that. But really, I guess if you're under the pressure of there's missiles coming from Russia, we don't know what to do. You have 3 minutes to decide. You don't have time to like pick a la carte from a menu. You have to really go. Let's go with the chef special, major attack option 1.
Right.
So they're clearly like rushing to make a decision about what to do. Why do you think that is? Because they're not taking the time to sit and debate this with the cabinet. They're like, let's go right now. We have 2 minutes to decide.
Yeah, I think they're kind of having this major time crunch largely because they the missiles that have been launched are enough to take out an entire leg of the triad. So if the missiles do kind of reach these U.S. silos or our ground-based ICBMs before they're airborne, that's a large kind of attack on our soil that hinders, I guess, our response capabilities as well.
Yeah, it seems like all we would have is after that, according to the military, is we would have a certain number of submarines with a certain number of missiles, which is probably quite a lot, and a lot of warheads there. And then we would have our bomber fleet, unless those all get knocked out as well. But yeah, that's kind of seems to be the theory of why we need to work so quickly. But not everybody's on that same page, though, it looks like. The chief of staff, right, is a little questioning of... He's the chief of staff? I think he's the chief of staff. He seems like a chief of staff. Yeah, he seems to be like, all right, well, what if we do something different? If we launch a full-scale nuclear attack, that's going to guarantee nuclear winter, which is kind of funny. Then the National Security Advisor says, oh, it's just a theory. It's no problem. And you're like, why are we just having these discussions for the first time now?
Right.
But anyways, it's people are definitely under pressure as this is happening.
Yeah. And I do think the chief of staff is kind of like a voice of reason saying, hey, maybe nuclear war isn't in our best interest, which is a good point to bring up, I guess.
Yeah. But what's the president? He opens up the suitcase. He's told to authenticate his nuclear launch codes. I don't know if that's exactly the terminology they would use. Usually when people think about nuclear launch codes, this is a movie thing. They think, oh, if you have these codes, you plug them into a computer, missiles get launched. But really, these are just codes. What they do is they authenticate that the president is the person speaking on the phone with you. It's like advanced caller ID. Basically. But it looks like they actually do a pretty good job of demonstrating, as we know in the open literature, of what these things looks like. So why don't you walk us through what the president does there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the president takes out this like kind of credit card sized case with the presidential seal on it, like one of those souvenir boxes of M&Ms you get after visiting the White House or something. Yeah. And he cracks it open, or cracks it in half to bring out a card. And this is called the biscuit. And it has several sets of numbers. Some are decoys, and then these are numbers that authenticate that the president is actually the president. So he or she would have to kind of remember the correct numbers and say it into the phone. Yeah,
and this is the thing that the new incoming president would be taught this whole process, like before they actually become presidents, because as soon as they take the oath, an attack could be incoming. so they get trained on this. Usually, I remember when Obama did it, and I believe I think also when W came in the first time. Usually, they get this training at the Blair House out in D.C., which is like an old style hotel kind of near the White House. But yeah, so then we see the president. He reads the codes. He even reads the attack option 1 stuff, and it's like, all right, here's what's going to happen. And then we cue the opening credit sequences, and we get a 12 hours earlier message. It's one of those like, I can't believe I'm here in this moment. Here's what led me to where I am today. I don't know. Do you like those kind of plot devices where it then jumps back in time and we see what leads up to that exact moment?
I kind of do. I like to start off with kind of right and running up into the action, and then taking the time to say, okay, what went wrong? How did we end up in this particular scenario? So okay. I think I like it a lot. What about you? Do you like it?
I don't like it as much. I don't like it when it's done multiple times, and I'm spoiling what's happening later. They do it again as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It's kind of neat. I do like shows that show you like a Rashomon type thing where you see the same story from multiple people's perspectives. So I like that, but I don't know. For this one, it's just like, all right, we're gearing up, and then it's like, all right, now we're going to slow everything down and do it again. I guess that works from a TV perspective. I don't like it when it's overdone, but this probably is just on the edge of being okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we kind of get to this like, all right, well, how can they possibly top this? Well, now we go into a hotel room, and there's somebody, it's a man and a woman in a hotel room, and he hear that they're doing stuff, and they're gonna knock on the door, and it's this guy's wife who says, screw you, here's the divorce papers, I'm out of here. And he gets all upset. We learn this guy is General Nelson. He's a high-ranking person who works in the Pentagon War Room, and I love this scene with him talking to one of the other military guys that works for him, and says, I can't believe I got served divorce papers last night. Can you believe this? It came out of nowhere.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's pretty reasonable. Pretty reasonable.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, so like, well, you're wondering maybe why is this happening? What does this scene have to matter? But then we find out that later on that he was in the Pentagon War Room, but not before U.S. Strategic Command out in Nebraska starts to get some hits on its early warning system, and it actually they start to list off real life locations of where Russian missile bases are located. And they say, all right, this place is lighting up, and they throw out a bunch of really cool, accurate military lingo. They didn't have to use any of these words. They could have made up new acronyms or anything like that, but they talk about, the commander on site there asked if there's anything on MoLink about this, and MoLink is the Moscow-Washington hotline, Moscow-Washington link. And what that is this is kind of when people usually hear about the red phone, the hotline connection that got started between the U.S. and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It never was a red phone. It was always kind of mostly some sort of teletype system that would print out information in a long strip because it was easier to translate. Then it became a fax machine, and now it's like an email system. But yeah, MoLink would essentially say if there was launches accidentally, say somebody pushed the wrong button and missiles started to fly out, there might be a message on MoLink that's like, I'm sorry, this is happening. Here's what this is. There's also, then the commander asks for SPARS, SSPARS reports, which is the solid state phased array radar system, which is used to track missiles and space launches from places such as Greenland, UK, and Alaska, which goes back to earlier when they were saying that there was in Alaska and in London and a couple other locations. But yeah, so everything seems to be working. There's missiles being in the air. Everybody is reading stuff on their screen like it's supposed to be actually, what it's supposed to be. So then it leads to the president's making a decision. So I don't know, what does the president do here? Because, it seems like all signs indicating something's happening.
Right, yeah. So because everything does look like it's up to par, kind of, so to speak, the president does give the confirmation codes for Major Attack 1 out of his attack book binder.
So many binders. First of many binders.
Right, yeah.
Ready to authenticate the nuclear launch codes on your call.
Ready for your challenge, Coach General.
Tango, Delta, 7822.
Victor, November, Niner, 582.
Copy, sir. Your orders?
Zulu, Echo, 6258.
Copy, Mr. President. Godspeed, sir.
The Cliff Notes kind of description of the plan in the book is, again, a most devastating attack option. Targets all potential sites deemed a risk factor, high probability of significant civilian casualties. And so then General Nelson at the Pentagon War Room, which is the National Military Command Center, or the NMCC, goes to send out the EAM, which is the Emergency Action Message that directs nuclear-capable forces to carry out attack plans to the rest of the National Command Authority. But kind of his laptop keeps giving him an error when he's saying he's unauthorized to do that, and so he should check his password or contact an administrator.
It's such a funny error to get at that moment. It's like
Right.
it happens to me all the time on my laptop, and I usually have to contact the IT person and then maybe to see if the IT person thinks I've been nice to them over the last couple of months. But this seems to be something more, right? He's not able to get into his laptop for a particular reason.
Right, yeah. So he keeps trying and just keeps getting locked out.
And I guess it turns out that he got his security clearance revoked that morning, which is really fast. So we got his security clearance locked out because of an HR issues, basically because he is under investigation now because of his divorce proceedings. He no longer can do his job. He's literally about to almost hit enter, send out the EAM to direct someone in a missile silo to push a button and direct maybe even possibly the submarine commanders to do their thing. And someone comes right in and says, nope, you're really strict about this. You lost your clearance. I don't care if we're in the middle of a shooting war with the Russians. You have to come and fill out some paperwork.
General Nelson. What? Your security clearance has been revoked under the Personnel Reliability Program.
We're at war, damn it.
And you must leave the building.
What the hell is this about?
Your divorce, General.
Right, casual.
Yeah.
Yep. And so this all happens kind of as President is boarding Air Force One and is told that the Pentagon is unable to give the launch order due to the HR issue. So they need to reissue the order to STRATCOM.
So this is something interesting. I don't know if this is true or not. I totally would be willing to say that it is. Maybe the people who write this episode know more than I do. But I would have assumed that once the president authenticates an order, that there are more people listening on the line, and it's not just the Pentagon War Room. That STRATCOM would also be on the phone writing to, they want to hear the orders. They don't want to be CC'd on the email later. Like, they want to hear what's supposed to be happening so they can coordinate. I would have assumed personally that once the president authenticates that order, it goes to everybody, because otherwise you get into the situation is what happens if, as the president authenticates the order, the Pentagon is hit and the president is hit. And then you no longer have somebody. You have to go down the line to the next level of continuity for someone to do this. I would have thought that they would have been listening on the call and that would have counted as authentication. But, for the purposes of the show, probably that makes sense. And I'm willing to concede if someone wants to at me on Twitter and tell me that this is actually how it would work, that you only can send a message and a launch order to one of these different places at a time, because you can send it to the military Pentagon War Room, you can send it to the National Command Authority, you can send it to Raven Rock, which is our Site R at Raven Rock, which is the military's kind of super secret bunker facility in Pennsylvania. You can send it to the Boeing E-4 Advanced Airborne Command Post, otherwise known, funny enough, as Night Watch. You can send it to that. Basically, it's a flying airplane command center. It got the name Night Watch because from a Rembrandt painting. This is such a weird way that this world works. There was a Rembrandt painting called The Night Watch, which showed local townsfolk protecting a town, and the name was selected by the squadron's first commanding officer. So you can send those to any number of these places. Maybe you can only send it to one at a time, but I would have thought that all people would be CC'd on these messages. But anyways, right, so that the president, this time around, he hesitates before wanting to give this STRATCOM order. He reads out of his binder, but either way, right, the colonel who's at now STRATCOM gives out the EAM and says, quote, "There is no turning back now." All right, so the message is out. The EAM has been sent. Who gets it on the other line?
Yeah, so then you cut to a conversation of two young men in a launch control center underground being interrupted by message 272 telling them to unlock the launch keys.
Here we go. Not a drill. Unlock launch keys?
I agree.
I have a match. Authentication confirmed. Belt up. insert launch keys.
So they grab some more binders. They're fancy red binders this time. And these are weapons system operation checklist for ICBM launch control. And essentially, these are the launch control officers authenticate the message. They belt up, kind of begin to insert the launch keys, and then they get ready to do something.
And then we kind of cut away, right? We go back to the Secretary of State. Someone finally gets a hold of her. It looks like maybe her Secret Service detail gets a hold of her. She gets basically told what's happening, but she decides, instead of seeking shelter with everyone else in the military, just to stay with her kids and her husband. I think the kids are playing air hockey before the missiles start to fall. So they decide it's too late. We're just going to stay together as a family.
We have a helicopter on top of the unified building. We have to hurry.
No, I'm not going. I'm going to stay with my family.
Actually, that was a pretty powerful moment.
Right.
Having them kind of gripped together, looking at their kids, because I guess the husband knows what's happening, but the kids have no idea. That's a really, really powerful scene. And that's replicated too, right, on Air Force One.
Where the chief of staff kind of wonders whether to call his family to warn them about the attack. But the president just kind of simply asks, what's the point? So everyone's kind of like resignation kind of at this point.
Yep. And here's where it goes to commercial, and we come back and we do another one of these 5 minutes earlier messages. And maybe this is where I decided it felt a little bit bad. And again, I don't want to hate the show. Like the show is very entertaining. The episode we saw is just a personal thing for me. I don't really like those 5 minute later things, unless it's done in like a comedic way. This is way it's a pretty dramatic one. We see the colonel from earlier who says it's no turning back now. He gives the launch order, and the launch officers are about to do major attack option 1. It's not looking good, but then we get this other military commander. He runs into Stratcom and just starts yelling, "Abort, abort!" And he pushes the colonel out of the way. I don't know how that would work in terms of like the security on site. And he types in like violently a new EAM message, and we see over in Minot Missile Base, the missile wing there, the silo-covered doors slowly start to open. I actually pretty sure they tend to, when they're under attack, like explode open, because they don't have time for it to slowly like open like a garage door. They open up. One of the launch officer turns the key, because they're both supposed to turn them at the same time. One of them turns the key all the way, but the other one hears like a beep, right? And a message on the screen that says abort, and it turns back to that other officer, and they haven't turned their key yet. So I guess at least for this one particular missile silo, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so Night Watch is kind of successfully called off, and the camera goes back to Madam Secretary, and she kind of faints with joy and I guess relief. And I think that's also pretty powerful, like watching her, all the stress kind of come off of her in 1 second. Yeah. I can relate to that.
No, she was really good. Tia Leone is awesome, and she's really good in this role. It's exactly the kind of reaction you would expect someone to have in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then after we see that, now we see her and her kids kind of finished up their air hockey game, and they didn't have any idea. So I think that's pretty powerful as well. And
the rest of the episode are a lot of meetings, a lot of Oval Office discussions. Some a little more heated. We get the chief of staff saying that that POTUS was almost head faked into starting Armageddon, which I thought that was a pretty good line. Now they're debating about what happened. Like, what could have possibly have caused this mistaken attack from happening? And what ends up happening? What is this whole series of events taking place?
So General Bradley at Stratcom had wanted to stress test his new equipment. So he asked IT to set up a simulation over the weekend that he could run when he got back to the office. And he didn't tell anyone. And the primary system failed before turning to the backup that had the simulation.
Yep, I guess he said, I like the joke was he wouldn't be bothered to come in on over the weekend. He's like, oh, why don't you set this up on Friday, and then on Monday we'll run the simulation on the backup.
Right.
And at first there's a bunch of kind of passing references. The National Security Advisor asks how this could possibly have happened since we, quote, changed the simulation procedure after 79. And at first, we're not really sure what that means. They eventually mention it, but I thought this was really cool. I think this is really where you get a lot of the input that people like Bruce Blair, and that whole crowd of people who were consulted about the episode. You can see them bringing in this interesting history. This particular incident was early morning in November 1979. Programmers at NORAD, which is, it's a system that's used to, nowadays it's used to track Santa Claus on Christmas on Christmas Eve, where Santa Claus is. But really what NORAD does is it tracks, all kind of space activity, including missile launches, and kind of what's happening. And they almost started World War III back in 1979 by accidentally running a simulation. National Security Advisor at the time, Brzezinski, he was told that the Russians had launched 2,200 nuclear missiles at the United States. The famous story about this was that he decided, similar to the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of State here in the show, was he decided not to tell his wife about this. He didn't want to tell his wife. He didn't want to wake them up. He didn't want to worry them. His big motivation was if he was going to go down, if it was true that they were about to be destroyed, then he wanted to have the Russians join him. He says if America would cease to exist, he wanted to make sure we had company. So that was his first thought after deciding he wasn't going to be telling his wife about the attack. Fortunately, he was told a few minutes later that it was just a mistake, that no other missile monitoring system around the world had actually seen the incoming strike, so it must have been a mistake. He never told Jimmy Carter, the president, until much later, and it was kind of seen as an error by a lot of observers because the president, even if it was of a false alarm, you have to tell the president and his team so that he can get taken away to somewhere safe. I guess what happened was that they tried to run a simulation, and that since then, this, procedure change was that they would remove all of the training activities, the simulations, all of those things, which back then were on like cassette tapes and training tapes. They would move those to a separate new off-site facility, and that's where they would do all these things. But apparently in this TV show, General Bradley decided that he didn't trust the off-site location and just decided to ignore the rule and brought the training simulation onto the actual system itself, which is, I wondered if the IT person would have noticed those rules. Maybe they weren't trained up on this. They were just told to do something, so they don't care. They just do that. So it's kind of funny that there would have been a full-scale launch if it wasn't for General Nelson committing an affair, which caused his security clearance to be revoked at the exact same moment, which delayed the launch order by just a few minutes, and that was all it took to recognize the mistake. But if he had decided that day that he was, I'll commit an affair the next morning or the next day,
Right.
we would have been in a bad situation here.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this isn't the only time that's happened in real life. Can you remember any other examples of false alarms and nuclear attacks in our real life that turned out weren't actually real?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So kind of other real life examples include, like, in 1950s, I think a flock of birds triggered a distant early warning line radar, and it kind of looked like a Soviet bomber attack. And so that's something. And then again in the 1960s, a meteor shower and lunar radar reflections triggered a BM early warning system at NORAD. And then again in the 1980s, we had a bad chip, which is the fail-safe kind of whole scenario. And then back in 1995, there was an incident with a Norwegian rocket as well.
That one looked like, because this Norwegian rocket had very similar missile parts for the rocket that looked like ICBMs. The U.S. told the Russians that this was going to happen, that this was a regular commercial launch, but then that communication never made its way up the chain until much later. And that was one of the few examples in real life history where the nuclear football was actually opened and activated, but never used on the Russian side, when they call theirs, I think, the Chaget, which is named after a mountain in Russia. One more fun story I like to add here is the one I think I've told before on the podcast, but I love it. Scott Sagan, who people know for being a scholar on nuclear deterrence and why nuclear weapons aren't so good. He told a story about at a missile base in Minnesota during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A guard mistook a bear for a Soviet saboteur, which sounds like an Onion headline. But an intruder alarm was sounded, made warning bells go off at other missile bases in the region. I guess the thought would be if someone is trying to infiltrate one missile base, they're probably other people trying to infiltrate the other one, so that they could stop the U.S. from being able to retaliate from an attack. So at Volk Airfield, the warning bells were wired up wrong, and instead of it being an intruder alert, it was signaling that there was an incoming nuclear attack. Caused all of the nuclear-armed jets to scramble, looking for enemies around the area, trying to figure out what's happening. And eventually they figured out, oh no, it was just a bear who caused a wire to go off, who caused other wires to go off, who triggered a nuclear attack warning. So you can see how quickly these things, people think that they are constantly prepared and everything. There's like backups to the backups, but it's a hard situation to bear. So yeah, so the rest of the episode isn't really more about, more tense moments, but you kind of get into politics and planning of how to respond here. What do you think of how the rest of this episode plays out? It's kind of interesting.
I think someone in the audience at our showing kind of mentioned how it was like no fighting in the war room from Strangelove. So I think it was pretty fun. But the Secretary of State kind of calls to de-alert the ICBMs, which that means kind of taking the warheads out of the missiles. So it takes time to prepare a launch, leaving more time to kind of think and kind of let more time pass in order to avoid accidents. And she kind of lays out the scenario we see, which she calls insanity.
That means Stratcom has 3 minutes to make the call to the crisis coordinator, who has 2 minutes to call the president. And then POTUS has 5 minutes to make a decision. I talk about vulnerability. It's insanity. After what happened today, how could we come to any other conclusion?
Yeah, maybe you should stay in your lane, Elizabeth.
Not if you're going to blow up the entire highway.
It's a pretty tight time frame to make very drastic decisions.
I barely wake up that quickly after my alarm goes off in the morning,
right.
Let alone like can you imagine being dead asleep and then Brzezinski calls you and says, all right, here's what's happening, make a decision in 5 minutes, and you're like, I don't do nuclear attack plans before coffee.
Right, exactly.
It is it's a tight timeline, but a lot of the other people in the room in the Oval Office don't like this idea. The National Security Advisor and the military people are all like, no, we can't do this. It would put too much pressure on the other legs of the triad, the bombers and the submarines. And this is a fun argument I hear a lot in the literature, and people make this argument a lot. They love this phrase. There's a reason why a stool has 3 legs, which is always kind of funny. There at one point, he calls her too emotional, right? Like, she can't be making any decisions, and that was not a thing you want to say to anybody, let alone the Secretary of State, who's this like no nonsense person.
That's the game we're in, and it's not going to change.
Why are you so dug in that you can't even see another point of view?
I'm not going to argue. You're obviously having an emotional reaction.
Normally, I would have a problem with a man telling me that I was emotional at work. But after what happened today, after thinking that I was seeing my kids for the very last time, you are damn right I'm emotional. And maybe emotion is what's missing from the stupid so-called logic behind our dehumanized nuclear posture.
And at that point, when the SecDef did call Madam Secretary too emotional, the entire crowd at our screen again just sighed. And I also think it's funny to point out the entire reason this they are giving rationale to this nuclear strike was because the Russian president, who's a man, was too moody. So it's kind of hypocritical to say that again here.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about that. That is the setup for this.
Right. Yeah.
But they do a pretty good job of countering this a little bit, where one of the other people that's pressing the to keep the missiles on high alert, on ready alert, because high alert, ready alert is kind of like the debate people say about lingo of whether or not you're pro-abortion or pro-choice or those kind of things, because it depends on what word you use, kind of indicates a little bit about what your position is. Like when you say missiles are on high alert, means that you probably think that they are on hair trigger alert. Like those phrases kind of indicate to the person listening that you're someone who wants to take them off of that status. Other people who are like, no, this is the safe way to have it so that it can be ready to respond, often call it ready alert. I think that's kind of funny. But the National Security Advisor is a woman. She's looks like an older woman. I don't know anything about her character, if she's in other episodes or anything, but she makes the case pretty strong that during a crisis, and I think this is a reasonable argument to make.
And what if there's a crisis and we have to go back on alert? A frenetic and unstable re-alerting race could spiral into a launch.
I thought it could be managed.
The people have to counter if you want to de-alert your weapons, which is in a crisis, if everything is demated and de-alerted, you would decide, all right, well, I'm going to signal to the other side that I'm going to get ready to use my weapons, or I just need to be ready because I think an attack's coming. But maybe you're not ready to attack just yet. But if you mate the weapons with the warheads, the missiles and the warheads, that can signal to the other side, a first strike is about to happen. So you have to worry about escalation control and how quickly messages can go wrong in terms of your signaling, or maybe you're not trying to signal anything. There's a good debate happening there, and it's not being made only by a bunch of white military men. It's being made by, the female national security advisor. So I thought that was a good piece to this discussion as well.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. I think that's very important, because while it's important to kind of include women's voices, it's also important to remember that not all women's voices are going to be the same. So I think that's a really good highlight at that point.
And finally, this discussion kind of ends with the president saying, all right, I want some more information. I want to sleep on this idea. And this chief of staff makes a moral argument, which I thought was pretty compelling, about how the current launch procedure forces the president and the military to essentially act like robots. That once this stuff happens, there's no moment for moral discussion or clarity about what they're doing. It's just, all right, if this happens, A, B, C, D, end of world. There's no point in this where they can kind of, because of the high pressure that's put into it, they can't wait for a missile to hit somewhere in the United States and then go, all right, we actually are under attack, now let's respond. You have to basically acrobatically. But what happens through the rest of the episode?
Yeah, so the rest of the episode, we kind of go back to Secretary of State's family, and so they're continuing to bicker and be on their phones or whatever. And now, because the Madam Secretary kind of realized that, hey, the world did end, she sees it in more like a loving kind of nice lens, I guess. And the parents kind of again reflect back on what they just went through. And then she gets a visit from the president, who kind of wants to open up a back channel with the Russians to kind of talk about mutual dealerting of the missiles. So kind of she wants to reignite, I guess, arms control talks between the two countries, so that this doesn't actually actualize itself in future.
But then we're also, you mentioned earlier about the guy playing tennis, who gets the message, and he just says, all right, I gotta go, it's a babysitting thing, and he leaves. And then we find out later, right, that he actually was kind of taken away to another location, and the rest of these staff members, are they in other episodes and have their own kind of stories and everything?
Yeah, exactly. There's a storyline kind of with in each scene where they pan to a new kind of character. They all have their own kind of storyline as well in previous seasons leading up to this point.
Well, these guys are all sitting around a table at a bar somewhere in DC and talking about people getting these messages that they're going to be swift away to Mount Weather. And turns out this is a real location, Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center. It's now run by FEMA, but it's where the quote-unquote lucky civilian government officials and other high-level people go in the event of a national or natural disaster or a national disaster. So it could be, a nuclear attack. It could be any sort of major thing that people are taken away from. This facility is also mentioned in another movie that I'm going to be covering on the podcast in coming weeks, or coming months maybe, 7 Days in May. They call it Mount Thunder, but it's pretty clear that it's what this is. And I don't know if you watched the X-Files, but it's also in the series finale, like the last episode of the X-Files, in 2002 anyways. They mentioned Mount Weather. But yeah, this staff member is not too happy that he's on this list, because they joke about, oh, you're going to be one of the people that gets to survive this. And, he's got a different perspective on it, right?
But let me just tell you what that particular privilege buys you. You get whisked away. You do. Without saying goodbye to your friends and family. And then you get to be in an underground bunker with generals and top government brass for weeks or months, eating MREs and drinking ionized water. You emerge after the radiation is reduced to livable levels, at which point you get to try to pick out your loved one's bones from the rubble and ash. And then you spend however many years running the bombed out husk of the former United States government under martial law. It's not a list that you want to be on.
It means that he will be kind of without his friends or his family, and he has to kind of continue to do this work while everyone dies around him, and it's kind of a depressing scenario.
Yeah, he mentions that, he'll have to come out of the rubble, and if he doesn't die of radiation poisoning, he will have to help run the remnants of the government under martial law. I think that's an important aspect, because any good post-nuclear war fiction should really delve on how important it will be. It won't be like the president still running a democracy after a large-scale nuclear attack, after any sort of large-scale, military invasion of this nature. The movie Threads does a really terrific job of this, of showing government will turn most likely into martial law because you'll need to have rationing of food and water, and you'll need to force people who are largely going to be like psychologically damaged by the attack. You'll force them, probably using food or the threat of violence, into work. And that work could be burying bodies, burning bodies, cleaning up rubble, forcing them into agriculture where there's stuff can grow. Like, it's going to get pretty bad. And it's not just going to be the old country, coming out of the bunker and having some sort of semblance. Like, the idea that you'll be running this under martial law, and this guy who probably volunteered to be because he likes democracy and he wants to be a public servant is now going to be one of the people who will be leading this if he decides to do it. It's not a great list to be on. Yeah. I kind of sorry to bring it down there, but I think that's kind of I'm glad that they have that in there. But the episode does end on a more hopeful note, right? The Secretary of State gets their de-alerting treaty with the Russians. There's still some resistance from the military and the U.S. Senate. But how do they get around that? Because they want to do a treaty. They don't just want to de-alert, which I thought was kind of interesting. I guess the idea is that if they do a treaty, then it's more legally binding. It's harder for the next president to roll it back. But obviously the Senate and the military is not too happy about it. So how do they go about breaking through the gridlock in Washington?
Yeah, I think what her main kind of plan is to just declassify the recent scare and all the other scares that have happened. So like they're really to like go public with all the close calls, I guess, that we've been to nuclear war. Mm-hmm. And so she really wants to again like kind of show people when we're considering this decision-making process, it's important to like show how dangerous the current kind of nuclear posture is and like how easy it is to like devolve into conflict just because of the simple accidents type thing. And so I think a good way to just summarize it is she just really wanted to like kind of scare the crap out of America to make DC function properly, which I think is a really good tactic.
Yeah. Well, the president goes on TV and essentially says, all right, here's what happened recently. Here's what's happened all the other times. We've got a treaty to solve it. So it's not just be scared, but here's the solution. The plan works. Enough pressure gets put on the Senate. I guess there's probably some rallies, probably some protests. It's not clear how long it takes, but the Senate ratifies the treaty. Everybody gets to resume the lives that they were leading at the very beginning of the episode, whether it's playing tennis, whether it's walking their dog, any of those things. The president goes back to playing golf, but the National Security Advisor and the Joint Chiefs person, Gordon, they refuse to join the golf game because I guess they're not too happy about it, and that's how they're going to protest. That's their resistance to not playing golf. Then the episode ends, and I guess this is maybe going to set up the next season 5, that the Secretary of State says she wants to run for president to continue fixing things, to keep her success moving forward. And I guess the next season will have some of those nuclear plots still ongoing. Is that right? I guess they're going to continue that storyline?
Yeah, so I think the season premiere, I think, is going to kind of talk more about the complexities of kind of continuing the de-alerting process and kind of continuing arms control agreements and talks. So it should be an interesting introduction to the next season. That's
awesome. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to keep watching the show week to week, but I will definitely watch the season premiere on October 7th at what time?
10 p.m. on CBS.
10 p.m. Eastern Time, CBS. They're gonna do the next season. So I'll probably check out at least that first episode. So that's the nuclear plot here. The whole thing. I think it would be good now to do. We normally do our parking lot movie discussion, which is something I used to do as a kid when we would go see a movie, and we would then talk about it with our friends in the parking lot before we went our separate ways. Well, this is a TV show, so this is more like a water cooler chat, asking your coworkers what you saw on the TV over the weekend. So what did you think about the nuclear plot? Did you think overall that it was realistic? That was it interesting? Was it entertaining to you as someone in the field?
Yeah, no, I think it was super entertaining. Even though like I do kind of deal with nuclear issues a lot all the time, I think it's still kind of fun to go in and see an episode that characterizes kind of very realistically. And again, I think this was I really enjoyed how they brought in experts to kind of make sure that their nuclear kind of dialogue is pretty accurate. And so I think a lot of times when you go and you like watch something that you do all day, you have a lot of room to critique it. And here I think it was pretty airtight, and I really enjoyed that. I did find it also really realistic. I think that the whole kind of concept of accidents happen, I think that was very well portrayed here in a way that wasn't so like Armageddon-y as like in the earlier kind of movies like Failsafe or stuff like that. So I really like that.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that the first half of the episode, it's just about the mistake that took place and how quickly people essentially just go into a rote routine, was super realistic, and it's very scary to see that happening. To me, it was a little bit weird because I don't really know any of these characters, so to see Leone and her family going through this, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I understand that that's a big deal, but I don't really know her. I don't know how she normally responds to things. So I'll say, for the credit of the show, me as a person coming just in cold, did a really good job of showing the decision points, the pressure that all these people are under. In a way, it almost kind of made it a little bit more interesting to me that I didn't know who these people were, and I still felt that they were under this tremendous amount of pressure. Anytime there's a scene where the president is like working out the football and discussing codes, my brain often goes and says, all right, well, I've seen this so many different times. What kind of place are they going to borrow from? Are they going to do Strangelove? Are they going to do, Sum of All Fears? Like, how are they going to pull this together? But they do it in such a unique and really cold, realistic way that in a way it's probably very realistic to how it would happen, unless you got a president who's a little more volatile. But I think that is a really strong point, because it is trying to underline about how, there's a message behind this. This is cold, rational thinking. There's no emotion involved, which also means morals. There's no moral calculation into this. It's, if this happens, you need to do attack option 1. And there's no discussion about what that actually means, which is the death of probably hundreds of thousands of people, the destruction of per bomb, millions overall around the world, the end of civilization as we know it, the martial law being instituted, people dying of radiation poisoning and burns and fires. Like, you don't get any of that from those little moments. You just see people solemnly flipping through binders and picking codes and reading them and plugging them into computers, and turning keys. I think that that's meant to be a criticism, and I think that is a really good portrayal of that in a pretty interesting way. Now, but the second half of the episode is, they haven't mentioned this on the panel discussion, it's like a little like a West Wing style. I don't know if the West Wing was a little bit too much before your time, but yeah,
a little bit, yeah.
for me, it was hitting it right on the spot. Like, I didn't watch the show until the last couple seasons live, like as it was happening, but it was a big part of why I would have decided to join a political campaign, to come to DC. All of these different things were because of the show. And rewatching it now, it's really hard to watch because it's very much, oh, here's how you solve problems in Washington. You give a good speech. You have the strong rational argument. You get the people on your side. But that doesn't always happen that way, especially when it comes to treaties about demating nuclear weapons. I mean, that's going to be if that ever happens, it's going to be a really big deal. It might take a moment like this, a crisis like this, that gets people motivated to do it. But it's not like, at least today, that all of these other close calls or broken arrows or things like that are super hidden. There are lots of books written about them. There are movies about them. We've covered these on the podcast before. A lot of these stories are out there. If you read the book Command and Control, if you watch the documentary Command and Control, you can see a lot of these close calls that have been taking place, but certainly hasn't motivated people to the public anyways.
Yeah, I almost think that if the plot had chosen to do kind of a more irrational president, kind of like that kind of type, take that approach instead, or maybe like showing like the Russian side of a similar thing. If we have an irrational president, I think that could almost be a little more hard hitting today to kind of encourage people to think about this again, just because of our current, I guess, situation here in DC.
There's a pretty good movie out there that's called Deterrence. It stars Kevin Pollak as a president who, there's a crisis going on in the Middle East, and he is doing some sort of campaign rally or something, and he's stuck somewhere in, I think, Colorado. He's snowed in at this like resort, and they're trying to, he's like, no, he's like, in a rational way, pro-military attack. Let's do everything we can. And it's kind of this weird, like, why are you doing this right now story? And it's all basically takes place in one room. Kind of interesting. So that's a different comparison to the more rational, even-keeled president here.
Yeah.
But how well do you think this show portrays, some of the real, some of the work you do with women of mass destruction? Like, how well do you think it portrays, women working in the national security field as you, someone trying to break into this field? Do you feel like this is accurate portrayal of those kind of discussions?
I would say yes. I think Téa Leoni's character has got a lot of kind of she's very well developed character, and I think she's getting a lot of respect from her male colleagues, including her president. And I think that's very important to remind. But I also think I like how they include that, like, even though she's like has a lot of agency and she is doing a lot, they just still include like there's kind of like that old bureaucratic like DC kind of military type persona that still doesn't necessarily as like opening or as receptive to her leadership. And I don't necessarily know if that's just a gender thing or if it's more kind of just the inner workings of DC type thing. But I do think that it's important that while she is respected and she's getting things done, there is still kind of a slight friction, even though it's not like necessarily as awful as it would have been in like the 80s or whatever. So I think that it does show it shows a good example of kind of how like women are like still they're clearly here and they're here to play, but there's still kind of some like institutionalized, I guess, doubt a little bit.
Was that a big part of like maybe some of the early seasons of the show?
I think it's kind of meant to be assumed that she is the equivalent of like a Hillary Clinton Secretary of State type thing. So they do mention Madeleine Albright and other important women in national security. So I think a lot of the earlier episodes are focused kind of on her character development and kind of showing like, I guess like they spend a lot of time kind of like developing her credibility. Like she's clearly like she's a professor at the school. So she clearly knows what she's doing. And I think a lot of time is spent doing that. But I don't necessarily think that it has to build up a lot of her like credibility, but it does kind of show, like I think in one episode there's an episode where a president like grabs her butt or whatever and like she slaps him, and like so that was like that was a pretty fun episode. But so I think there's like it still shows the difficulties of it, but I think I also kind of respect it because it doesn't necessarily spend too much time on trying to like stoke her credibility, because it's kind of like pre-given that she's already pretty like qualified for the position.
Cool, excellent. So we usually end our episodes by doing a rating system because we want to be consistent. So we have a 1 through 5 rating. 1 being low, I don't like it very much. 5 being I really like it. But because we get super critical about the topics, I really like to be super critical about my rating system. So for this one, I'm gonna do here 1 out of 5 invitations to a secret government fallout bunker. Because 1 invitation is it's enough to survive a nuclear war, but it's you'll just be you. But 5 means you can invite 4 of your buddies and you'll have a great time over there. So I'm going to give this one a 4, a solid 4. I really like the story. The first like 2/3 of the episode, very well done. I love the accuracy for most of the plot points here. Really drives home how scary this would be for people in terms of their decision making. I'm just a pessimist about how a de-alerting treaty would end up happening. So I think to me that may be fitting with the show. So I'm willing to give it a little bit of slack there. That may be how the show resolves a lot of these things. Obviously, I like The West Wing, and most of their stories are very similar. But that's the only thing that keeps it for me in a solid 5. But it's definitely a strong recommendation that I would give to people that are interested in these kind of topics. What about you? How many invitations to a secret government fallout bunker would you give this one?
Yeah, I think I would also do a 4. I do agree that it's kind of a bit melodramatic at points, just because I think that's the nature of the show. It does get a little drama-y for me, but I really enjoyed how well the women in the show were portrayed, as well as how well the accident kind of escalation aspect was portrayed. And I also thought it kind of seemed to fizzle out near the end when we got towards the more bureaucratic things. But I think that it was probably just a segue to the next season. So I'm excited to see kind of the next season premiere and see how they're going to continue with this thread.
Good, solid recommendation. So speaking of recommendations, usually we also like to have at the end of the episode a few things that if you liked listening to this topic and if you liked the episode of the TV show, kind of what else could you use to watch or read or something that's very similar. I'll recommend a few things here. Maybe you have something to recommend, but I'll first recommend 3 other movies that we've covered on our podcast before if you haven't seen or listened to those episodes. Ladybug from 1963, which is about a false missile scare and it's how teachers and students in like an elementary school, how they deal with these issues, whether or not the missile attack is real or not. It's really a terrific, scary story. I also recommend the movie Failsafe from 1964 and War Games from 1983. Again, both stories about presidents dealing with either false alerts, false messages of attack, sometimes caused by sentient computers, other times caused by glitches in the software. I think those are really good stories and really complete out this literature, and I think that this episode of Madam Secretary gets to fit into that genre pretty well and will be welcomed by people that are interested in this topic. I also recommended a New York Times article from January 2018. It was written in the wake of this Hawaii missile scare. It's called Causes of False Missile Alerts, the Sun, the Moon, and a 46-cent chip. So it kind of talks about that story that we mentioned earlier about the computer chip malfunction. So check that out. I'd also finally recommend an article in Foreign Affairs magazine from September/October 2002 called The Death of a Treaty. It's written by Terry DeBell from the National War College. It's about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty vote in October 1999 in the U.S. Senate, and about how politics got intermixed with national security arguments. It was one of the things that got me into this field, was watching those debates. Reading about those debates kind of made me want to work for people that I ended up working for, which was, at the time, Senator Joe Biden, because he was one of the floor leaders on that debate. Hearing those things is why I'm in this field, but it's also very depressing because the treaty was voted down largely as a response to Clinton not being impeached, and a lot of the national security arguments got ignored. And it shows that even though the public was like 70% in favor of the CTBT treaty, it was not enough to get people to vote for the treaty itself, which at the time required a 2/3 vote in the U.S. Senate. So I think that's unfortunately a pessimistic response to kind of how the public support for an arms control treaty doesn't necessarily translate into its success. Clearly different from the episode, because the episode was involved of like scaring people as opposed to people thinking, yeah, arms control is great because it makes peace, but versus if you don't do this, we're going to have another one of these crises. Different story, but you want to see a little bit of a different historical perspective on it. Check out the article, The Death of a Treaty. Jamie, do you have anything you'd recommend to people?
Yeah, actually, there was just a short film released. So as you may know, earlier this week on September 26th, that was the 35th anniversary of the day a Russian soldier called Stanislas Petrov kind of saved the world. And so this week there was a short film released, and it's called The Man Who Saved the World. And it's about the Cold War story, about how this one man kind of prevented a nuclear strike that would have escalated the world into World War III. But it's a pretty cool movie, and kind of really timely, as it was just the 35th anniversary, and I think it relates back to the theme of escalation control and accidents.
So this was a story, right, where the Russians thought the U.S. was attacking Russia, and this person was like, I don't know, I don't think so, I don't think this is really not the right thing. Let's hold off.
They were in a submarine, and it was 4 of them, and they needed 3 to move on, and all 4 in order to launch. And he was the only one who said no, and it turned out he was right. His gut feeling was right.
If I remember right, the story is pretty sad because his life was ruined for a little while after that. I think that's the story. I want to see the documentary to confirm that. I know that was the word on the street was that he lost promotions and things like that since then because he was disobeying orders, but he was right.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, cool. That's excellent. Anything else, or that's a pretty good recommendation?
Yeah, I think that's all I have, really.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for those recommendations and for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate you Skyping over from an early morning in California over there. So thanks very much. Where can people find you on Twitter and your website? Let's share those one more time before we end up.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at my personal account, which is at Jamie Withorne. Or you can follow my website, which is at woman_WMD. And my website, again, is www.womenofmassdestruction.org.
And that's Jamie Withorne, so it's JamieWithorne.
Yep,
right?
That's correct.
I never can spell things unless I have them spelled to me. So that's great.
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, future guests, or you want to tell us what we got wrong, there are a couple ways you can contact the show. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. We're on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast, and also the old-fashioned way, email supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the program, okay, why don't you go on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show, leave a 5-star review and tell us what future episodes and things that we should be covering here. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Jamie Withorne.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.